Noah, could you stop embarrassing my family and serve the drinks? After all, it's the least you can do since you don't contribute anything else to this household. Victoria's words cut through the air in the dining room like a sharp blade, followed by an awkward silence that lasted exactly 12 seconds. I counted each one as I stood next to the $15,000 mahogany table, the wine bottle in my hand trembling slightly. The 8 members of the Whitmore family stared at me with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled disdain. The patriarch, Richard Whitmore, cleared his throat uncomfortably before turning his attention back to his plate of lamb. Victoria's mother, Patricia, sighed dramatically as she adjusted her diamond bracelet. Victoria, maybe. Her younger brother James tried to interject, but was silenced by an icy stare. No, James. Someone needs to speak the truth here. Noah has been living off us for too long. My name is Noah Sullivan, and at 34 years old, I have just been publicly humiliated by my wife of 8 years in front of her entire millionaire family. But as Victoria savored her small victory, flashing the cruel smile I knew so well, she had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because what she didn't know was that 3 weeks ago, I had discovered something that would change everything. Something that would turn her arrogance into despair and her inherited wealth into ashes. I poured the wine meticulously, my expression remaining neutral as Victoria continued her performance for the captive audience. Seriously, Dad, you should see how he stays home all day pretending to work on that ridiculous startup. As if anyone would invest in his crazy ideas. Richard Whitmore, president of Whitmore Industries, nodded slowly. His investment company had rejected my business proposal 6 months ago, not because it lacked merit, but because Victoria had specifically asked him to deny me funding. She wanted to keep me dependent, controlled. The penthouse apartment, the car, the expensive clothes, all paid for with family money, Victoria gestured theatrically. And in return, what do we get? Nothing but empty promises and projects that never get off the ground. Every word was carefully calculated to belittle me, to reinforce the narrative that I was a parasite who had married for money. What they didn't understand was that I had recorded this conversation, as well as dozens of others over the past 2 years. Patricia leaned forward, her jewelry jingling softly. Honey, you should have listened to your mother when we suggested a more rigorous prenuptial agreement. Mom is right, Victoria agreed, her eyes sparkling with malice. But don't worry. I've already talked to the lawyers about how to resolve this situation. It was at that moment that I realized the true extent of her plans. It wasn't just public humiliation. It was an orchestrated strategy to completely isolate me before the final blow. Victoria intended to divorce me without me receiving anything, using her influence and resources to ensure that I left the relationship exactly as I had entered it, empty-handed. Dinner continued with increasingly venomous comments. Jokes about my humble origins, not so subtle references to my inadequacy for the Whitmore standard, speculation about how much longer they would have to support me. I finished pouring the last glass and quietly retired to the kitchen, where I finally allowed a smile to cross my face. If this story of revenge and reversal is holding your attention, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple dinner would become the catalyst for the downfall of an entire empire. Because while Victoria was celebrating her masterful performance in the dining room, imagining she had finally put me in my place, I was calling someone she would never have imagined. Someone who had been waiting for this very moment longer than anyone could have suspected. The call was answered on the second ring. Dr. Hawthorne. My voice was low, almost a whisper in the empty kitchen of the Whitmore mansion. This is Noah Sullivan. The time has come. Jonathan Hawthorne, 73 years old, a corporate lawyer and former mentor to Victoria's late grandfather. A man who had been systematically excluded from the family business over the past 5 years by Victoria and her father, on the grounds that his ideas were outdated for the new times. Noah, his voice carried a hint of satisfaction. I was wondering when you would make this call. The evidence you showed me last week was enlightening. From the dining room, I could hear Victoria orchestrating yet another session of humiliation, now focused on how I had wasted the opportunity to work in the family business. What she didn't mention was that this opportunity had come with humiliating conditions. I would be hired as an administrative assistant, earning less than the junior secretary, just so she could control me completely in the professional environment as well. Dr. Hawthorne, how long would we need to implement the first stage? With the documentation you've collected? 48 hours to present everything to the board. 72 for the first legal consequences to begin to manifest. Victoria Sullivan, née Whitmore, at 32, was the heir apparent to a $150 million empire. With a degree in business administration from Harvard and a master's in finance from Wharton, she had all the credentials necessary to lead the family business. The problem was that her credentials were as fabricated as her public persona. During our 8 years of marriage, I had been both a witness and a victim of her gradual transformation. The intelligent and ambitious woman I met in college had become a calculating manipulator, willing to destroy anyone who posed a threat to her narrative of superiority. In the early years, I genuinely believed she loved me. Victoria was charismatic, engaging, and when she focused her attention on someone, it was almost impossible not to feel special. But slowly, I realized that I wasn't her partner, I was her project. She had chosen me not out of love, but because I represented a specific type of accessory, the talented but non-threatening husband who would validate her image as a successful woman without ever overshadowing her own achievements. The first warning sign came in our 3rd year of marriage, when Victoria secretly sabotaged my interview for a position as Chief Technology Officer at a rival company. She had called the CEO, a family friend, and suggested that I was not emotionally prepared for such responsibility. At the time, I believed her version that she was protecting me from a rash decision. The second sign was when I discovered that she had quietly canceled my application to an entrepreneurship program at Stanford. When I questioned her, Victoria explained that we couldn't be apart for 3 months, that our relationship was too important. Once again, I swallowed the explanation, interpreting control as care. The third sign was devastating. She had convinced her parents to reject my proposal to invest in the startup without even properly analyzing it. Richard Whitmore had decided that my home automation platform project was too risky, based solely and exclusively on his daughter's advice. Victoria had argued that investing in me would create a family conflict of interest, and that it was better for me to find my own way. But it was only 3 weeks ago that I discovered the full truth about who I had really married. I was organizing the files in my home office when I found a forgotten folder behind the printer. Inside, I discovered copies of emails between Victoria and a private investigation company. For 2 years, she had been monitoring my activities, my professional contacts, even my phone conversations. Not out of paranoia or insecurity, but as part of a deliberate strategy of sabotage. The emails revealed that Victoria had systematically interfered with every professional opportunity that came my way. She contacted potential employers, investors, even clients, always with the same story. I was emotionally unstable, had a history of unfinished projects, and was unreliable for long-term commitments. It was all a lie, but coming from a Whitmore, people believed it. Even more shocking was discovering that she had manipulated our social life in a similar way. Friends who stopped inviting me to events, colleagues who became distant, networking opportunities that simply evaporated, all the result of a silent and meticulous campaign to isolate me and make me dependent exclusively on her and her family. The most devastating email was addressed to Dr. Hawthorne, the family lawyer. Victoria requested a legal analysis on how to ensure that, in the event of a separation, I would not be entitled to any part of the family assets. She had begun planning our divorce over a year ago, building a dossier to portray me as an opportunist who had married for financial gain. At that moment, everything became crystal clear. Every gesture of affection, every word of support, every promise of partnership had been an act. Victoria wasn't building a marriage, she was building a trap. And I had spent 8 years helping to build it. Dr. Hawthorne, I murmured into the phone, is the emergency board meeting still scheduled for Monday? Perfectly scheduled. The independent members are curious about the irregularities I mentioned, especially considering that some documents compromise not only Victoria, but Richard as well. This was the key piece Victoria would never suspect. While she was investigating me, I had developed my own system of documentation. Every intercepted email, every recorded phone call, every uncovered manipulation had been carefully preserved and authenticated. But more importantly, I had discovered that her sabotage violated federal laws on business interference and, in some cases, constituted criminal defamation. From the dining room, I heard Victoria explaining to her relatives how she was protecting the family fortune from my financial instability. If you're following this twist and want to find out how this web of lies finally unraveled, be sure to subscribe to the channel to see what happens when someone completely underestimates the person they're trying to destroy. What Victoria didn't know was that while she was savoring her performance today, I had already implemented the first phase of something that would turn her privileged life into a series of legal and financial nightmares from which she would never fully recover. Dinner proceeded like a public execution orchestrated with the precision of a court-martial. Victoria had turned the mahogany table into a stage where each dish served was accompanied by a new calculated humiliation. "James, tell Noah about your promotion at Goldman Sachs," Victoria suggested with feigned casualness, delicately cutting her grilled salmon. "Maybe he can learn something about how people our age build real careers." James, 28, adjusted the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, a gift from his parents for his promotion to vice president. "Well, Noah, it's not that complicated. You work hard, deliver results, and people recognize your value." His voice carried that natural arrogance of those born with silver spoons. "Exactly," Patricia nodded, her jewelry jingling softly as she gestured. "It's a matter of having real ambition, not just fanciful dreams." Each word was a social stiletto, carefully sharpened to cause maximum damage under the guise of civilized conversation. I remained silent, pouring ice-cold water into Waterford crystal glasses, while mentally cataloging each offense for the dossier Hawthorne was compiling. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with malice. "Noah had big plans when we met in college. He was going to revolutionize technology, create the next Google." She laughed, a sound I once found musical, now sounding like breaking glass. 8 years later, we're still waiting to see anything come of those brilliant ideas. What she didn't mention was that she had systematically sabotaged every attempt I made to turn those ideas into reality. During our phone conversation earlier today, Hawthorne had confirmed something devastating. Victoria had not only interfered with my career, but had also violated federal laws of business interference in the process. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of decades of commanding boardrooms. "Noah, have you considered exploring more traditional opportunities? I have contacts at several companies that are hiring for basic administrative positions." Basic administrative positions. A man with a master's degree in software engineering from MIT being offered filing jobs. The irony was not lost on anyone at the table, especially me. "Dad's right," Victoria agreed, placing her hand on mine in a way that seemed affectionate but with enough pressure to hurt. "Maybe it's time to accept your limitations and find something more suited to your level of competence." It was at that moment that something fundamental changed inside me. It wasn't explosive anger or desperate sadness. It was a crystalline coldness, an absolute clarity about what needed to be done. Every venomous word, every condescending smile, every gesture of false superiority was being recorded and documented to destroy them. Caroline, Victoria's younger sister, finally decided to contribute to the massacre. At 25, a recent liberal arts graduate with a consulting job arranged by her father, she spoke with the authority of someone who had never faced real rejection in her life. "You know, Noah, when I was little, I used to pretend I was a princess waiting to be rescued. But I grew up and realized I had to build my own castle." She took a sip of the $200 wine as if it were water. "Maybe you need to make the same transition from fantasy to reality." The whole table laughed at Caroline's observation, their laughter echoing through the dining room like crows celebrating a carcass. Victoria clapped slowly, as if applauding an exceptional performance. "Caroline has always been the wisest in the family," Victoria declared. "She'll go far in business with that insight." What none of them knew was that 3 hours earlier, I had finalized something that would turn their laughter into nightmares. While they savored their small social victory, I had signed the final documents that officially transferred all the patents for my failed startup to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The same startup that Richard had rejected as too risky was now valued at $42 million by Asian investors who understood its real potential. The same technology that Victoria had derided as fantasy was being licensed to 3 of the world's largest automation companies. "Noah seems pensive today," Patricia observed, studying my face with predatory curiosity. "We hope he's not planning another quixotic project with our money." Our money. As if the apartment Victoria lived in, the car she drove, and the bank account she used were the result of some joint effort by the Whitmore family. In reality, during our 8 years of marriage, I had contributed 70% of all household expenses through freelance projects and consulting, while Victoria spent her family allowance on clothes and dinners like this one. "Actually," Victoria addressed me directly for the first time that evening, "we need to talk about some changes that are coming." Her tone shifted subtly, carrying a note of purpose that made the rest of the table pay attention. This was the moment she had been orchestrating for weeks, the final coup in her campaign of humiliation. I had a very productive conversation with our attorneys last week, Victoria continued, playing with her wedding ring theatrically, about restructuring our financial situation to protect the family assets. Richard and Patricia exchanged a knowing glance. James stopped eating. Caroline leaned forward expectantly. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone had been briefed in advance about this moment. It's important to protect the family estate from unnecessary risks, Richard added, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in hostile takeovers, especially considering the financial instability of certain associations. The word associations was pronounced as if describing a contagious disease. I was the contamination that needed to be isolated and removed from the Whitmore system. Victoria smiled, that smile that once made me feel special, now revealing itself as the expression of a predator preparing for the final attack. Noah dear, I know this may be difficult to accept, but we have reached a point where we must recognize that our life goals have become incompatible. Incompatible. 8 years of marriage reduced to a cold corporate word. 8 years where I had supported her every decision, financed her every whim, endured every humiliation in the name of what I believed to be love. Obviously, we will do this in a civilized manner, Victoria continued, now speaking directly to her family as if I weren't present. The lawyers have already prepared the appropriate documentation to ensure a smooth transition. A smooth transition. Euphemistic language to leave me with nothing while she kept everything. The apartment that was in her name, but that I had helped pay for. The car she drove, financed with my consulting income. Even the jewelry she wore, purchased with bonuses from projects I had completed. Caroline raised her wine glass. Here's to new beginnings and courageous decisions. The entire table raised their glasses, everyone looking at Victoria with pride and approval. No one looked at me. I had become invisible, a problem being solved, not a person being destroyed. It was at that exact moment, as I watched 5 people celebrate my complete humiliation, that the last piece of my plan fell perfectly into place. Hawthorne had warned me that we would need a defining moment, something that would make Victoria's predatory and calculating nature clear. A moment that no judge or jury could interpret as anything other than deliberate cruelty. This was that moment. I rose calmly from the table, my expression as neutral as that of a professional waiter finishing his shift. "Excuse me," I murmured, heading for the kitchen. No one responded. Their voices continued to celebrate as I walked away, discussing details about lawyers and timelines as if they were planning a vacation. In the empty kitchen, I pulled out my phone and sent a single message to Hawthorne. We got everything we needed. Execute Phase 2 tomorrow at 9 a.m. The reply came within seconds. I'm already preparing the documents. Justice is coming. I returned to the dining room and resumed my silent position beside the table. Victoria was explaining to James how the divorce would positively affect the family's finances, using terms like elimination of liabilities and optimization of resources. She spoke about me as if I were a red line on a financial spreadsheet that would finally be deleted. What Victoria didn't know was that while she orchestrated my public humiliation, I had spent months documenting something far more devastating than her petty social cruelties. Something that would not only destroy her reputation, but completely dismantle the family empire she considered untouchable. As the Whitmores celebrated what they believed to be my final defeat, I stood there, serving coffee and watching. Not as a victim accepting her fate, but as a strategist cataloging the last details necessary to implement the most meticulous and devastating revenge any of them could imagine. The real game was about to begin, and this time, I had all the winning cards in my hand. Monday arrived with the precision of a metronome. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, while Victoria was drinking her $308 organic coffee in the mansion's kitchen, Hawthorne was presenting an emergency motion to the Whitmore Industries Board of Directors. I was in my makeshift office in the apartment, the same one Victoria had derided as entrepreneurial fantasies, coordinating the most complex operation I had ever planned. 3 computer screens displayed information that would make last night's dinner look like child's play. Phase 2 confirmed, Hawthorne's voice crackled through my Bluetooth headset. The independent board members have requested a full audit of family operations. Richard is unsettled. Unsettled was an understatement. Richard Whitmore had built his empire through a combination of family inheritance, strategic marriages, and business practices that bordered on criminal. During 8 years of observing family dynamics, I had cataloged inconsistencies that would take a forensic accountant months to uncover. At 10:15, my phone rang. Victoria, her voice carrying the controlled irritation I knew so well. "Noah, I need you to cancel your appointments for today. We're going to the lawyer's office at 2 o'clock. "What for?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "To finalize our arrangements. I thought I made that clear yesterday." Our arrangements. As if 8 years of marriage could be dissolved like an unsuccessful business contract. But there was something different in her voice today, an urgency that hadn't been there at dinner. Something had changed, and she was accelerating her plans. "Sure," I replied calmly. "I'll be there." What Victoria didn't know was that while she was orchestrating my family humiliation, I had spent 3 weeks implementing something far more sophisticated than emotional revenge. I had woven a legal and financial web that would turn her inherited arrogance into a lesson in humility that would last for decades. The first piece had been simple, documenting her violations of federal trade interference laws. Every company she had contacted to sabotage my career had kept records of those conversations. Every investor she had dissuaded had saved emails. The pattern of interference was so consistent that it constituted criminal conspiracy. The second piece was more complex. For years, Victoria had used family company resources for personal gain, from hiring private investigators to monitor me to funding her own romantic escapades with rival executives. Every transaction was meticulously documented in systems she believed to be secure. The third piece was devastating. The startup Richard had rejected as too risky was now being licensed to Asian tech giants for sums that would make Whitmore Industries look like a corner store. The same project Victoria had derided as fantasy had become the basis for a revolution in home automation. At 11:30, I got the call I had been waiting for. "Noah." The voice was female, young, nervous. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, from Whitmore Industries Accounting. Dr. Hawthorne said you could help me." Jennifer was the junior accountant who had discovered the irregularities in Victoria's spending. A 26-year-old woman, recently graduated, who had noticed discrepancies that senior auditors had ignored for years. Not because of incompetence, but because Richard paid very well to keep certain inconsistencies invisible. "Jennifer, do you still have access to the family's international transfer records?" "Yes, but..." "Noah, this could cost me my job." "Jennifer, what you discovered could save the entire company from federal money laundering charges. The question isn't your job, it's whether you want to be part of the solution or be considered an accomplice to the problem." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 15 seconds. When Jennifer spoke again, her voice was steady. "What do you need?" Over the next hour, Jennifer guided me through a financial maze that revealed the true extent of the family's corruption. The offshore accounts, the fictitious investments, the charitable donations that returned as consulting fees to shell companies controlled by the family. Victoria wasn't just a manipulative wife, she was part of a sophisticated criminal operation that had been running with impunity for 2 decades. At 12:45, I headed to the lawyer's office. Victoria was waiting in the reception area, impeccable in her $3,000 suit, exuding confidence and control. When she saw me, her smile was instant and predatory. "Punctual as ever," she said, kissing my cheek theatrically. "Today marks the beginning of a new phase for both of us." Robert Morrison, the family lawyer, welcomed us into his panoramic conference room. A 60-year-old man who had facilitated decades of questionable legal maneuvers for the Whitmores, always with the justification that he was protecting family assets. "Noah," Morrison began, spreading documents across the table, "Victoria explained to me that you have reached an amicable agreement regarding the dissolution of your marriage." Amicable agreement. Euphemistic language for accepting that I would be expelled from the relationship without receiving anything for what I had contributed over 8 years. "Victoria told me about your recent financial difficulties," Morrison continued. "We have offered a generous solution considering the circumstances." Financial difficulties. They still believed the narrative that I was a parasite living off the family. What they didn't know was that my failed startup had generated more revenue in the last quarter than Whitmore Industries had in the entire last year. What would that solution be? I asked, my voice neutral. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes shining with anticipatory satisfaction. $50,000 as a final settlement. In exchange, you sign a complete waiver of any claim to family property, investments, or assets. $50,000. 8 years of marriage, financial contributions totaling over $400,000, and they were offering $50,000 as if it were generosity. It's a fair offer, Morrison added, considering you haven't contributed significantly to the accumulation of family wealth. If you're following this tense negotiation and want to see how this family arrogance will turn into the most spectacular fall you've ever witnessed, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out that some people confuse generosity with weakness until it's too late to correct the mistake. I need 24 hours to consider, I replied, keeping my expression contemplative. Victoria frowned. Noah, it's a more than fair offer. I see no reason for delay. 24 hours, I repeated firmly. As I left the office, I heard Victoria explaining to Morrison that I had always been indecisive, and that this confirmed her suspicions about my instability for serious business. They interpreted my pause as the hesitation of someone who finally recognized his inferior position. In reality, I needed 24 hours for Hawthorne to finalize the documentation that would turn their confident smiles into expressions of utter horror. Because while they celebrated their generosity of $50,000, I was about to reconfigure the entire power structure they considered untouchable. The real negotiation was just beginning, and this time, I held all the winning cards at a table where they didn't even know they were playing. The next 24 hours unfolded like a symphony of destruction orchestrated with surgical precision. While Victoria celebrated her anticipated victory at the five-star spa she religiously frequented on Tuesdays, I was coordinating the most meticulous implosion the Minneapolis corporate world had ever witnessed. At 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, my phone rang. Hawthorne, his voice carrying a satisfaction he was struggling to contain. Noah, we have movement. The Whitmore Industries Board of Directors has called an emergency meeting for 10 o'clock. Richard is trying to cancel it, but the independent members have invoked the urgency clause. And Jennifer? She's been at the FBI office since 5 in the morning. She brought back more documents than we expected. Apparently, Victoria wasn't the only one using corporate resources for personal gain. At 8:15, I got the first panicked call. James, his voice trembling like a lost child. Noah, what the hell is going on? Dad is getting calls from federal attorneys. They say there's an investigation into the company. I don't know what you're talking about, James. Don't lie to me. Does this have to do with yesterday? With the divorce? The beauty of the truth is its simplicity. James, I offered 24 hours to consider your proposal. I still have 14 hours and 45 minutes. The silence that followed was delightful. I could hear his brain processing the impossible math. How could a man they considered defeated be causing a federal investigation when he apparently hadn't even responded to the terms of the divorce? At 9 o'clock, while Victoria was probably receiving her $200 Swedish massage, I was at Whitmore Industries headquarters, being escorted by federal security guards to the main conference room. Not as a defendant, but as a protected witness and, more importantly, as a whistleblower who had provided crucial evidence for a 3-year investigation into money laundering and corporate fraud. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the oval table, his usual impeccable appearance now betrayed by hands that trembled imperceptibly. When he saw me enter, flanked by 2 FBI agents and Hawthorne carrying 3 thick folders, his face visibly paled. What does this mean? His voice retained its executive authority, but I detected the crack beneath. Special Agent Caroline Morrison, a 40-year-old woman with an impeccable track record in white-collar financial crimes, spoke up. Mr. Whitmore, this is an official board of directors meeting to discuss irregularities discovered in a special audit requested by independent members. Noah, Richard addressed me directly, trying to regain control of the situation, you're getting involved in something you don't understand. It was Hawthorne who replied, his voice carrying 73 years of legal authority. Actually, Richard, he understands perfectly well. Mr. Sullivan has a master's degree in software engineering with a specialization in financial systems. Over 8 years of observing family operations, he documented inconsistencies that took our firm 6 months to fully verify. The first folder was opened. Inside were screenshots of offshore transfers, contracts with shell companies, fictitious donations to charities that returned as consulting fees to accounts controlled by the family. 8 years of evidence I had collected simply by paying attention during family dinners. This is ridiculous, Richard stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor. You're giving credibility to a resentful man who is getting divorced. He obviously fabricated evidence out of revenge. Agent Morrison smiled, That cold smile of someone who holds all the cards. Mr. Whitmore, the evidence Mr. Sullivan provided has been corroborated by our own independent investigation. Jennifer Walsh, his junior accountant, has also provided documentation confirming patterns of activity we have been tracking for 3 years. It was at that moment that the true extent of my plan was revealed. While they saw me as a parasite living off the family, I was in fact functioning as an unwitting spy at the heart of a criminal operation. Every dinner, every conversation, every document left open at home had been an opportunity to collect evidence. The second folder contained something even more devastating: complete records of Victoria's sabotage of my career. Emails to potential employers, calls to investors, even messages to former college classmates discouraging partnerships with me. But here was the element she never considered: intentionally interfering in someone's business for personal gain constitutes a federal crime when there is evidence of conspiracy. Where's Victoria? I asked casually, noting her obvious absence. My daughter is, Richard began, but was interrupted by the ringing of his phone. He glanced at the screen, his face running through a range of expressions before settling on pure horror. She's being arrested, he muttered, as if he couldn't believe his own words. At her spa, I clarified conversationally. Federal agents have the authority to make arrests anywhere. I imagine it was quite dramatic. The third folder was my masterpiece. Licensing agreements for my failed startup with Asian companies, showing figures that made Whitmore's net worth look like pocket change. Internationally registered patents. Distribution agreements that generated monthly royalties exceeding Whitmore Industries' annual revenue. That's impossible, Richard whispered, leafing through the documents. Your company was a failure. Victoria showed me the reports. Victoria showed you the reports I allowed her to see, I replied calmly. While she was sabotaging the American version of the company, I had registered all the patents internationally through a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands. The technology you rejected is now generating $42 million in annual revenue. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard slumped heavily in his chair, finally comprehending the scale of the reversal that was taking place. Mr. Whitmore, Agent Morrison continued, based on the evidence presented and the ongoing investigation, we are freezing all Whitmore Industries assets pending resolution of the criminal charges. This includes corporate accounts, real estate, and personal investments of all family members. You can't do this, Richard attempted one last stand. I have lawyers. I have connections. Hawthorne leaned forward, his smile carrying decades of legal battles won. Richard, your lawyers are now under investigation for complicity. Your connections are distancing themselves as quickly as possible. As for me, well, you fired me 5 years ago. Consider this my retroactive resignation letter. My phone buzzed. A message from Morrison at the law firm where 24 hours ago, Victoria had offered me $50,000 as if it were charity. Meeting cancelled indefinitely. Client in federal custody. I stood up calmly, adjusting my tie, the same one Victoria had criticized the week before as inappropriate for important social events. Richard, you mentioned that I needed to accept my limitations and find something appropriate to my level of competence. I walked over to the panoramic window that offered a complete view of Minneapolis. You were right. Accepting my limitations was exactly what allowed me to overcome yours. When I turned around, Richard had his head in his hands. James had arrived during our conversation and was standing in the doorway, his face cycling between confusion and horror as he realized his entire world was falling apart. Noah, James murmured, what have you done? I documented the truth, I replied simply. For 8 years, you treated me like a piece of furniture. Furniture observes everything, but no one pays attention to it. Every scheme, every illegal transaction, every compromising conversation took place in my presence because you believed I was too irrelevant to matter. Agent Morrison addressed Richard. Mr. Whitmore, you have the right to legal representation, but I must inform you that your assets are frozen, which may complicate the payment of attorney fees. It was at that moment that the last element of my plan was revealed. I pulled a document from my briefcase, a signed purchase agreement. Richard, that apartment where Victoria and I lived? That view you always admired? I bought it yesterday. With cash. His eyes widened as he processed the information. That's impossible. You don't have the money to. I had $5 million in cash from international patent sales. I used $2 million to buy the apartment. The other 3 are invested in a variety of ways. I paused, letting the information sink in. The apartment is now worth $4.2 million. Good location, as you always said. Their world had been turned completely upside down in exactly 24 hours. The man they considered a parasite had turned out to be a millionaire. The company they believed they controlled was being investigated for federal crimes. The daughter they thought was protected was in custody. Oh, and Richard, I added, standing at the door of the conference room he had controlled for decades, about that job offer in basic administrative positions you mentioned. I'm going to respectfully decline. I'm too busy running an international company. As I left the Whitmore Industries building for the last time, I passed the reception area where Victoria's photo was displayed on the executive wall. In a few hours, that photo would be removed and replaced with a notice that the company was under federal administration. The most satisfying revenge was not seeing them lose everything, but realizing that they never really had anything. They built an empire on lies, maintained power through crime, and confused fear with respect for so long that they forgot the difference between real success and illusion. Now there was only one conversation left, the most important one of all. Victoria would be released from custody in a few hours on bail, and when that happened, she would discover that the apartment where she had lived for 8 years now legally belonged to the man she had tried to humiliate into submission. Victoria was released from federal custody on Thursday morning, 3 days after her dramatic arrest at the spa. Her $500,000 bail had been paid by a distant aunt in Boston, apparently the only relative who still had enough liquid assets to help. She arrived at our old apartment at 10:45, her key sliding uselessly in the lock I had changed on Tuesday. The doorman, following my specific instructions, politely informed her that she should contact the new owner to schedule a visit. New owner. Her voice carried that familiar indignation, as if the universe had made an administrative error. I've lived here for 8 years. Ma'am, the apartment was sold the day before yesterday to Mr. Noah Sullivan. I have orders to deliver this letter if you showed up. Inside the sealed envelope was a single sheet of paper with my handwriting. Victoria, your personal belongings are stored in Unit 23 at Secure Storage on Lyndale Avenue. The monthly fee is paid through December. After that, the responsibility is yours. Sincerely, Noah. 2 weeks later, I learned from Hawthorne that Victoria had accepted a plea bargain with the federal prosecutor's office. 5 years of probation, a $2 million fine, and a lifetime ban from holding executive positions in public companies. Richard received a similar sentence, but with 2 years of actual imprisonment. Whitmore Industries was dissolved, its assets sold to pay fines and damages. James moved to Portland, where he works as a junior financial analyst at a medium-sized company. Caroline canceled her master's degree in arts and opened a small gallery with what little remained of her grandmother's inheritance. Patricia, the matriarch who once shone at charity dinners, now lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in Minneapolis, living on a modest pension and memories of when the Whitmore name meant power. As for me, life has taken directions I never imagined possible when I was serving wine at that fateful dinner. My home automation company has expanded to 12 countries, employs 400 people, and is valued at $120 million. I bought a house in Edina, overlooking Lake Minnetonka, where I work from an office I designed specifically to maximize creativity and productivity. Nothing ostentatious, but functional and truly mine. Last week, Jennifer Walsh, the accountant who risked everything to expose the corruption, accepted my offer to become the CFO of my company. Hawthorne now serves as chief legal counsel, finally using his expertise to build something ethical. The apartment where Victoria and I lived remains empty most of the year. I use it occasionally for business meetings or when I need to stay in the city during trips. More importantly, it has become a tangible symbol that I am completely in control of my own destiny. I hold no grudge against Victoria. Anger requires emotional energy that I prefer to invest in productive projects. She made decisions that revealed her true character, and the natural consequences of those choices inevitably manifested themselves. The real victory was not seeing her lose everything, but discovering that my identity never depended on her or her family's approval. For 8 years, I allowed them to define my worth based on standards that they themselves constantly violated. Today, when young entrepreneurs come to me for mentoring, I always share the same lesson. People who need to belittle others to feel important reveal their own fundamental insecurities. Don't let other people's mediocrity define your limits. If this story of transformation and poetic justice has touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories of people who have turned humiliation into motivation and apparent failure into extraordinary success. The last time I saw Victoria was by chance at the Minneapolis airport. She was in line to board a domestic flight, dressed in simple clothes and carrying a small suitcase. Our eyes met briefly. She waved discreetly, a gesture that could be interpreted as a cordial greeting. I returned an equally neutral wave and continued walking toward the international departure gate, where a flight to Tokyo awaited me. Some stories end with dramatic explosions. Ours ended with a silent recognition that each of us had found exactly the fate our choices deserved.